All right, so off we go with the post-Civil War era. And anytime you get one of these major events, you really see kind of a new game beginning and a new status quo, a new situation. And so this is definitely true in the United States after the Civil War. And we'll see a lot of these institutions go all the way up through World War II and even beyond. And so we can definitely take that as kind of the middle era of American ethnic and immigration history. So we're going to take this region by region. So in the South, which was obviously where a lot of the issues were leading up to the Civil War pertaining to slavery. So, of course, the Civil War partly ends slavery with the 13th Amendment, and African Americans are given citizenship through the 14th Amendment and the right to vote through the 15th Amendment. So there should be clear paths ahead, but there are problems. And the Southerners basically figure out ways to deal with slavery and the things that they lost by losing slavery, but they were able to recreate them in certain ways. So, for example, how do you replace slave labor in the Southern economy? And the main way they're going to do that is through sharecropping. And so you have to put yourself in the shoes of liberated slaves. They have no education, they have no money, their families scattered throughout the country, they don't know where most of them are. And after the celebrations end, you basically need to figure out how you're going to survive. And so as a former slave, what do you know how to do? You know how to pick cotton. And so there are plenty of planters around who can't have slaves anymore, but they may very well be able to hire African Americans to rent part of their land. And so in other words, if you have a big plot of land, you can tell a laborer, I will share part of my crop with you in exchange for your labor. And this is where we get the term sharecropping. But there was a catch, and this caught on very quickly, and that is you can tell the laborer, you can rent part of my land, I still own it, but you can work it and get part of the revenue and product for yourself. You can also rent a home from me, you can rent your supplies from me, and so on and so forth. And basically you get to the point where, especially with an unsuspecting former slave who's uneducated and might be taken for a ride, you're basically going to wind up owing in rents more than you're bringing in your share. And so this puts you back into debt, and it's perpetual. It gets worse every month. And of course, the only way to work off a debt if you don't have the money to pay it back is through labor. So presto, you've got slavery reenacted virtually through sharecropping. Sharecropping is going to be around for a very long time, all the way from the aftermath of the Civil War well into the 1960s. We also get the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. And in these early days in the South, they were basically people who believed that it was basically hell coming to earth to try to live alongside whites and African Americans next to each other. And so, ironically, these were also largely uneducated, poor white Southerners, and they, for whatever reason, and there were a multitude of reasons, they were resentful of the freedmen and turned to terrorism in order to intimidate newly liberated African Americans to not participate in civil actions. And so they would portray themselves as ghosts and put cloaks over their heads and do it on their horses, and for this reason they become the invisible empire that would appear, do its damage, and then disappear. And one of the main things they try to do was to intimidate African Americans into not participating politically. And so they would do floggings and hangings and lynchings and burn down houses and churches and try to scare African Americans into not doing the things that have just been granted to them through the actions of the Civil War. The biggest thing that's going to come out of the South in the post-Civil War era is Jim Crow, which is better known to most as segregation. So something important happens that we need to point out, and that is In 1896, we get an important Supreme Court case called Plessy versus Ferguson. And this is where the Supreme Court deals with these Jim Crow laws, which were really attempts by the South to not have to integrate, whites that is, to have to integrate with African Americans. And so this all stems from the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment, which in one sense gives African Americans and anybody who's born on American soil citizenship. This is something that we still fight about today. But at the same time, it says that in a clause of the 14th Amendment that says everybody has equal protection of the law, meaning everybody has to be treated the same. You can't apply the law one way to somebody and a different way to another. And so for this reason, the Southerners are going to say, well, okay, as long as everyone is treated equally, or equal under the law at least, meaning everybody still gets to have school, access to public buildings, and all this sort of thing, we can do that. What about if we make them separate? Hence the term separate but equal. So what if we have white schools and black schools, white playgrounds and black playgrounds, white drinking fountains and black drinking fountains, all the way to restaurants and inns and everything. And so this case, which seems to be inherently unequal since only one side is making the rules, goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And in this case, Plessy versus Ferguson, Homer Plessy is a guy who refuses to play by the rules on the trains. The trains were segregated, and he didn't want to be subject to the black train and also wanted access to the white train. So this is foreshadowing what Rosa Parks will do down the road. The Supreme Court comes back and issues another one of its horrific decisions and says that, yes, as long as the institutions are equal, there's no reason why they can't be separate. And so Jim Crow laws were upheld by the Supreme Court in 1896, and this will be true all the way until 1954, as far as the Supreme Court is concerned. And so this was another way that the Southerners kind of reenacted slavery or separation between whites and blacks. Now, they also did other things to try to prevent what has been enacted for African Americans. In another case, it was voting rights. And I go up at the second bullet there. There were a lot of things that the southern states did to try to prevent blacks from voting, even though the 15th Amendment had given black males the right to vote. So one of these things was literacy tests. Literacy tests are basically reading exams. If you want to be eligible to cast a ballot in an election, you have to be able to read. Now, not the worst thing in the world in itself, but it was used for discriminatory reasons. And that's not going to be dealt with all the way until the 1960s. Poll taxes will eventually be eliminated down the road in the 60s, but for a long time you had to pay a fee in the South to be able to vote. And of course, poor blacks in the South a lot of times did not have the money to pay those taxes and therefore could not vote. And there were several other measures, bizarre things like grandfather clauses, where your grandfather had to have voted if you were going to be able to vote. And then they had white primaries and all kinds of things, little tricks that basically were legal and were, tripwires for preventing blacks from voting. So these are the kind of things that the Southerners are able to accomplish. And so if you ever wondered why, even after the Civil War, we have the South, this prejudiced and unfair South for so many years, these are the reasons. These things were legal. They weren't doing things illegally in the eyes of the law at that moment. And so for this reason, they were able to get along through these things for a very long time. Let's shift over to the West now. Lots of things are starting to happen. Chinese immigration is starting to really come in big numbers now. And there are definitely push and pull elements in this situation. The push would have been things that were happening back in China to force these immigrants to come to the United States. High taxes were one of them, which basically put small farmers in China out of business, and so they're going to leave and seek better situations abroad. The pulls were the same things that pull other immigrants at this time, and that is work opportunities in the United States, and they're plentiful. And you got to remember, the Chinese are coming to the West Coast as opposed to immigrants from Europe who had always come to the East Coast, where there was a lot of factories. on the West Coast, the industrial infrastructure hasn't really arrived yet, and so they needed to find other things for work, and those things. The timing. This is why this happens now, because the timing is right. For example, the gold rush happens, and there are plenty of Chinese immigrants who are going to come and try to strike it rich there. When the vast majority of them don't, and discrimination disallows them from gaining land grants and things, or land claims for the gold rush, and then they turn to other kinds of labor like the Transcontinental Railroad, where basically they are the ones who are carving the Summit Tunnel for the Central Pacific Railroad going over the Sierra Nevadas. And in addition to that, others are going to come and do make it to the East Coast in industry. Others are going to work in irrigation and agriculture out here in the West. But when it's all said and done and things become stable, the Chinese are going to carve out small communities for themselves in a lot of the major cities, what we now call the Chinatowns, where they're definitely get the reputation for starting businesses, whether they be restaurants or laundries or small stores. And definitely through a strong work ethic are able to establish themselves in the face of discrimination a lot of times. But by the time we get to subsequent generations way down the road, we see Chinese Americans a lot of times integrating themselves into society, Americanizing, and becoming part of the landscape of American culture and society. Now, at first, almost all Chinese immigrants were men, and the West, in its rugged state in the pioneer days, was seen as too harsh and too expensive to bring women along. However, at the end of the first generation and through the second and third generations, we do start to see women arriving, but many of them were in prostitution. And if you watch movies or TV shows about those days, you will frequently see white Western pioneers or businessmen having Chinese brides or engaging in prostitution with Chinese American women. Like I said, Chinatowns and theaters and stores are going to be popping up all over the place. They're still with us today in big numbers. And the thing that really comes into scope that is probably predictable for many people is that Chinese immigration represents a whole new ballgame, and that is that these are not white people. These are not people from Europe. They're not Christians. And they have a totally different lifestyle and culture. And so they are kind of seen as the others, just like Native Americans and African Americans and to a degree Hispanics also. Different than how we might see Irish or German or Western European immigrants. And so from the beginning, they're kind of at a disadvantage compared to other immigrants, and are also breaking new ground by immigrating on the West instead of the East. And so these things, straight up racism and discrimination, but also things pertaining to labor competition. People on the religious side are going to have issues with them not being Christian, and so there's deemed this Chinese problem in America, and this was one of the times, and this is going to become a trend where in America it becomes fashionable to be anti-immigrant and especially anti-Chinese. So Congress actually legislates this prejudice through the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. And so therefore, new Chinese immigrants are banned outright from entering the country. Those that were already here were able to stay on most occasions, although there was a lot of squabbling on that. And this law is going to be on the books all the way until 1943. And it's going to be reenacted and modified and doubled down upon several times by Congress in the coming years. The other big issue going on out west, in fact, there's another one after this too, and that is dealing with Native Americans. So this is a story that we've seen before, and as Americans continue to move west, they encounter new Indian tribes and nations along the way. So now the final stretch of white Americans dealing with Native Americans. Out west, we see some pretty epic struggles and some pretty sad stories. And so, I put in quotes battles or massacres. A lot of these events are going to be labeled one of the two, depending on whose perspective it is, who launches attacks first, or who gets the short end of the stick, and as far as casualties. So I'll just list a couple for you that will kind of represent a lot of the things that are happening. And so we've seen a greater amount of encroachment by white Americans in the West upon lands that Indians call home. Lots of reasons: gold rush, transcontinental railroad, the various trails. The Homestead Act also gives away free land to Americans to encourage westward migration. And so this basically butts them up against Native Americans who have been established there for quite some time. So, for example, the Sand Creek Massacre is one major event. This actually happens at the end of the Civil War, where 400 Indians are killed by Americans out west. The Battle of Little Bighorn is probably the most famous event, and this is in 1866. And it was actually a retaliation for the death of 81 soldiers in Wyoming who were ambushed by Sioux Indians. And so this Army General, George Armstrong Custer, decides he's going to get payback a few years later. And this is the ultimate in biting off more than you can chew, because he goes in overconfidently and tries to wipe out the Sioux once and for all, and instead he and his entire cavalry were slaughtered. After that, the U.S. Army goes in and actually does finish the job. And this is a story that is repeated. We see the same thing with the Apaches down in New Mexico, and that is there's squabbles, there's events. Sometimes the Americans start it, sometimes the Native Americans start it. Either way, the Americans come in with big numbers, whether they be military or otherwise, and eventually will gain the upper hand. And so definitely a lot of these examples out west. Right around this time, after some of these events, people start to take note of how horrific these events are, and also begin to reflect on the whole relationship between Americans and Native Americans. And so in 1881, Helen Hunt Jackson kind of puts these feelings into words with her book, A Century of Dishonor, which outlines the government's treatment of the Indians over the years. And many, many people read this book, and it encourages even more minds to change. And so this begins the movement toward reconciliation with the Native Americans, which is going to be a very long-lasting change of heart and action. And you could argue we're still going through this today. But Congress issues this law, this Dawes Severalty Act of 1887, which was intended to be a kind gesture and a fair gesture toward the Native Americans. And it didn't come off that way, but it's really the beginning of the reservation system, where the American government is willing to set aside big swaths of land and give them to the Native Americans, which has happened before, but this is done in a much more regimented and an official way in most cases. And so one of the goals, though, was that, kind of the deal was, if Native Americans were willing to become more Americanized and ditch their traditional cultural behaviors, these reservations have self-rule, get a citizenship in the United States, and they would be, everyone would be happy and well. But it didn't come off that well, because Native Americans don't want to ditch their traditional cultures. They don't necessarily want American citizenship. And the reservation system is kind of a small consolation for what they had the freedom to do whatever they wished out west. Now they're being confined to these small areas, and so and again, it was kind of one-sided. It was the United States saying, we're going to do this for you, and you don't really have a choice, and we're going to make the rules along the way as we go. So some of the big reservations are set up. The Great Sioux Reservation in North Dakota and South Dakota, into Montana, So big swaths of land are set aside for the Native Americans. And the other one is Oklahoma. Oklahoma was where kind of the end of the line of the Trail of Tears was. And for a long time, that was supposed to be the Indian Territory. That is until we get to the end of the 1800s, and Americans wanted that too. And so that didn't really wind up that way. But if you look at a map today of reservations, you can see that we still have reservations scattered throughout the western United States. For example, the entire eastern half of Arizona practically is all Native American reservation land. And then if you look at California, in the central part of California, you got all these little speckles of Indian reservations that you probably have heard of before. And of course, inevitably we're going to have some sad stories that are going to go along with this. The worst of which is probably Wounded Knee in 1890. And so remember, part of the deal was that Native American tribes had to ditch their traditions. And so one of these things for the Dakota Sioux was to do a ghost dance, which, nothing more than a religious ritual. And the U.S. Army went in there and said, stop doing the ghost dance. And they refused, and then we had a bloody free-for-all on that night. And so, again, intended to be something progressive in the relationship between Americans and Native Americans, but again, it was a kind of a swing and miss and led to more tensions. And there's definitely some other things we can mention about the whole thing, but that's the Dawes Severalty Act of 1887. In 1924, we get the Indian Citizenship Act, which granted full citizenship to all indigenous people in the United States. And so this was another attempt to move in the right direction, enacted partially in recognition of those thousands of Indians who served in the armed forces in World War I. And so this one, unlike the previous law, the Dawes Act, was definitely a move in the right direction and positive in every way. The Indian Reorganization Act was part of the New Deal. And this is where we see a final reversal of the Dawes Act by allowing Native Americans to adhere to their cultures. I guess it took 50 years to realize that that was a non-winner. But it protected the right of Native American nations to be self-governed and have greater control over their land. Some were very hesitant to believe it. And for good reason, even after this. Then the Navajos, for example, rejected the plan because they had felt like they had been set up so many times that the Americans were going to go back on their word. And they were proven right, too, because a lot of times what land that had been granted to Native Americans for their own use, their own governance, when the Americans would come in for agriculture or something and say, you need to do this kind of crop and here are your water situation. There'd be so much mingling that they felt like it wasn't their land anyways. And so these two laws in the early part of the 1900s, again, attempts to decrease that division between Americans and Native Americans. The last group we need to mention in the West are the Japanese Americans. Japan is industrialized in the 1800s, and this is what we call the Meiji Restoration, where the Japanese government has decided it wants to be an industrial power. It adopts Western ideals in business, in military, and even some in society, but largely Japan keeps its traditional culture, but adopts Western economic and political systems. And so the farmers are slowly being pushed out in exchange for industry, and so a lot of them head for America. In Hawaii, which by this point, at this juncture, is an American territory, not a state yet, but a lot of Japanese people are moving into these areas to work in the sugar plantations, and there are some skirmishes there as they are competing for jobs with other Asians. In California, some of the same situation. We see some sharecropping. They couldn't own the land because of alien land laws, so that non-whites cannot own land. And so they would be sharecroppers, and the same things we saw in the South are going to happen here. The first generation of Japanese Americans were called Issei, and they were cut off in 1907 by the so-called Gentlemen's Agreement. And this stems from some segregation that's happening in the schools in the Bay Area, where California decides it's going to segregate the Japanese students from the other students. And Teddy Roosevelt is the president at this time, and he makes a deal with the Japanese government that says where we will stop the discrimination and the segregation in the schools as long as you and Japan agree to cut off more immigration to America. And that was accepted. And so the Nisei, or the second generation, were born from the Issei who were already in America, but additional immigration to America from Japan had been cut off. And this is actually going to be legislated into law in the 1920s. And so for several decades in American history, the Japanese were not allowed to immigrate into the United States. However, you did have these Japanese Americans who were already here, who were, having families, multiplying, and second and third generations were becoming Americans at that time as well. Now, at the same time, things are happening out west with Asian immigrants. We are seeing a huge influx of new immigrants coming into the Northeast. And there are two main groups that we can point to. One is the Jewish Americans. Now, the Jewish Americans are obviously not coming from one place. There is no Israel at this point. And so they're coming from various countries, mainly Russia, places that would be like Poland or other Slavic countries, and Germany. And they come for various reasons. They are pushed out by discrimination. We know that there's anti-Semitism for a long time all over the world. There still is today. And so they come to America, again, as in the place where opportunities exist, and they mostly come to major northeastern cities like New York. And so this was seen by many as the new Exodus, just like we saw with Moses in the Old Testament. So now we're seeing the Hebrews on the move again to a new place, a new promised land, so to speak. Most of these Jews were what we call Ashkenazi Jews, which means they come from Russia and Eastern Europe. Most will come to New York, but also other northeastern cities. And they're in those early days, in that first generation, it was very tough. They moved into these ghettos where there was very crowded, very dangerous tenements. And they also call them dumbbell tenements, where you would have rooms, 2-room apartments with hallways in between, but you'd have multiple families crowded into these rooms. And after a while, people come in, journalists would come and take pictures and write stories about how just horrific the conditions were in these ghettos. But the Jews definitely proved to be very industrious right away. They were, of all these groups, the most willing to Americanize right away. And so they start delis, they start restaurants, they do the peddling, like ice cream carts or hot dog carts down the road. Women are going to labor in clothing. We see a lot of textile workers with young Jewish women. And so, like I said, they were the most willing to become Americanized, and so a lot of them changed their names. A lot of them are going to celebrate Christmas, and it was a time where it was definitely expected that immigrants become American, and the Jewish Americans were most willing to do that. Still, even with all that said, they weren't Christians, and they were also Eastern Europeans, and so, again, they were kind of seen as not quite fully Americans by a lot of people, and so there was still anti-Semitism amongst these people. But like I said, this is the heyday, along with the Italian Americans that I'll talk about next, of the immigrant in the late 1800s coming through Ellis Island. This is where a lot of those images that we have are happening between these Jewish Americans and also so other Europeans too. We have Slavics and Polish and Italian, Greeks. A lot of these people are going to be coming at this time. The Italian Americans kind of have a lot of the same problems that the Jewish Americans did, and that is, while they are white, while they are European, they are largely Catholic, and therefore met some anti-immigrant ideas from the nativist Americans. And they were also kind of these Mediterranean, southern European folks were not quite the same as the accepted European immigrant at the time. So pushed out by overcrowding, by poverty, but also pulled to America by a lot of the labor shortages. Same story as everybody else. So we're going to have as many as 4 million Southern Italians coming to America, a lot of them Sicilians, coming in the 1880s all the way up until the 1920s. The contribution of the Italian Americans, we can still see it today. Lots of very strong cultural and family ties. Even though they too were definitely willing to Americanize, they also held on to their family traditions. And so their food and their music definitely come with them. And we can still see it today. People love Italian American food to this very day. Just like the Jews, they're going to congregate in their small, compacted communities in large eastern cities, these little Italies. In fact, in New York City, you can go and visit those places now. Chinatown is right across the street from Little Italy. But they were Catholics, and they were poor in many instances, and so they did meet some nativism from Americans who were already here. But Italian Americans also paralleled what we saw with the Germans and the Irish, and that is they quickly climbed the social ladder as entrepreneurs and bankers and other things. And their willingness to Americanize, they were quickly established here in the United States as being granted true Americans. So some things that happened during this time. This is a very interesting time for immigration in the United States. And that is that you kind of have a mixture of responses. Now, what liberal historians will tell you is that every American was racist and that everybody hated the immigrants and spat on them and all that. And there were definitely some of those people. These were called nativists, and kind of an anti-foreign mentality. Without even knowing the person, you assume they're bad because they come from another country. And this definitely happens throughout American history from the beginning, but definitely in this time period with some intensity. But they would blame these immigrants for urban decay, for their slums that were destroying the beauty of the cities. They would also drive down wages because immigrants are usually willing to work for less than Americans are, citizens are. And then, with Jews and Catholics and Buddhists from China, you see that you kind of sense that there's an assault on traditional Protestant Christianity as well. Another thing that you would see during this time is social Darwinism. And this is important to note because at the same time all this is happening, Darwin has published his On Origin of the Species, and where he says that evolution occurs in nature, and only the strongest survive, the weak die out. And so inevitably you had a social scientist, there are several who came along and said, well, that applies to society as well. In society, some people are strong, some people are weak, and the strong are going to survive and the weak are going to die out. And so the weak were applied to the poor immigrants who would either sink or swim. And the strongest were the ones who were the wealthy or the politically savvy or whatever. And so those are some pretty harsh ideas. And some of these are very dangerous because, a guy like Adolf Hitler will come on down the road, and other fascists who will say, yeah, our kind of people is the best. Other kinds of people, like Jews, are going to be the worst, and so we need to get rid of them and destroy them. So very dangerous idea, the social Darwinism. However, not everybody had these viewpoints. Some people were very welcoming to immigrants. Some of them gave them the benefit of the doubt. Some people helped them. The social gospel amongst many Christians at this time de-emphasized salvation and instead emphasized helping poor immigrants. How much does Jesus tell us that you got to help the poor? You have to be poor in spirit yourself in order to initiate the kingdom of God. And so a lot of Christians take that to heart and engage in ministry for immigrants at this time. And some people who were secular, like Jane Addams, also made it their careers and their missions in life to create these settlement houses, which are places that tried to help immigrants get integrated into society. They would teach them English, provide counseling, child care service, all these kinds of things. And part of that is, Americanization, and part of that is, having a heart for the poor, having a concern for helping people strive in society. And so you had the whole gamut of reactions to immigrants at this time. World War I changed a lot of things. We have another major event here for immigrants and people who are descendants of immigrants now in the United States. So there are 8 million Germans in the United States as World War I breaks out, and rumors begin immediately, since the Germans in Europe are the ones responsible for really making the war happen. And so Germans really kind of get the brunt of it here in the United States during that time, being accused of being spies and sabotaging the war effort and so on and so forth, to the point where hamburgers, Hamburg is a city in Germany where supposedly the hamburger is invented. So now we're going to call them Liberty Steaks, and sauerkraut, which is a German condiment, is now Liberty cabbage, and so on. And so there's definitely an anti-German sentiment in America at this time. We also get the Sedition Act, which is very reminiscent of the Alien Sedition Acts that we see early in American history, where if you are going to criticize the American government and say disloyal, profane, or abusive things about the government or anything during the war, you can be arrested and imprisoned. And supposedly it was a national security issue and so on, but make no mistake that it was targeted at immigrants and socialists. Because you also have to remember, during World War I, the Russian Revolution is happening. And so many people are very fearful of communists and socialists running around talking about the overthrow of the government and that the workers rise up and launch revolution, things that Vladimir Lenin said. And so that was definitely kind of a watch your back kind of thing to immigrants from the Wilson administration. But strikes were very common for the same reason, that you were seeing a lot of politicization of unions at this time because of what's going on in the brand new Soviet Union, or what will be the Soviet Union. And so this idea of communism, socialism is still with us today, the tensions that it creates. But in those days, we see lots of groups like the Wobblies, for example, who were politicized unions who were willing to be violent in order to achieve their political goals. And it caused a lot of strife for the war effort, because we needed things to be made, we needed workers working. And so all of this kind of, this anti-immigrant sentiment that happens, or anti-European or anti-socialist sentiment in World War I, really creates a lot of division. And that's what I want you to remember about World War I. It's really a war where it expands upon our divisions along ethnic and racial lines, and there's very little unity at the time. The Roaring Twenties sees kind of an extension of this nativist sentiment, this anti-European and anti-communist sentiment. And so it leaks over into the 20s, and the KKK appears at this time. This time, in addition to kind of being anti-black, they're also anti-anything that's not American. So they're anti-foreigner, anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish, anti-communist, all these sorts of things. They were also, ironically, anti-bootlegger, anybody who didn't follow the 18th Amendment. They didn't like them either. And so the KKK kind of continues it on. Nativists, traditional nativists, are going to carry that on. Prohibition in the 1920s, which is the banning of alcohol, again, largely targeted at Germans, because Germans, a very common slogan at the time were the drunk swine, because they brought their beer over here and they're constantly drunken. And make no mistake about the timing of prohibition happening at a time when Germans and German Americans were kind of seen as a low point in American culture. And then the Italians, who had come over in the era before the war, they kind of are starting to get some pushback too, because this is the golden age of the mafia. Golden age, kind of a misnomer, but Al Capone and others in the 20s who were bootlegging alcohol and launching prostitution and gambling and kidnapping celebrity babies and all that sort of thing. This kind of puts a symbol on all Italian Americans, that they are criminal, just horrible for society and all this sort of thing, when in reality a very small portion are going to be in the mafia and be lawless people. So this all can be packaged together in the 20s as it's a kind of a revival of traditional America, where Americans are, you have to be a true American to really be part of the society, and there was kind of some pushback on some other immigrant group and minority groups. The anti-immigration hysteria gets so loud that Congress starts to be part of the act as well. And so we get two major immigration laws in the 1920s. The first one is the Emergency Quota Act. And as these Eastern and Southern European immigrants continue to flood in, Congress establishes a new rule for how many of those groups can come in. And so the number is 3% of the 1910 population. So this is for each nationality, so Italian, Polish, Russian, and so on. And so 3% of however many of those kinds of people were there in 1910, that would be the yearly amount let in for each given year. And then a lot of people decided that it wasn't strong enough, and so the Immigration Act of 1924 makes it even more severe. So we cut the quota down to 2% based on the population from 1890. And the reason they rewound the year back to 1890 is that there were far fewer of any of these groups. And then you take it down to 2%. And now you're talking about just about shutting off immigration into America during the 1920s and part of the 30s. Some caveats were that the Japanese were outright banned in coming to America. So like I said, the Gentleman's Agreement is actually legislated into law. And then Latin Americans were exempt from the law, which may surprise a lot of people. But the reason is because they were needed for the agricultural labor that really is going to be the very early beginnings of an issue that we'll have throughout the rest of American history regarding Mexican immigration and farm labor. All right, so let's do a little bit of review to wrap up this section. So this era of American ethnic history is marked by at least some people or many people making major attempts to bring issues of equality and anti-discrimination into the center of the national debate. Whereas you'd be talking about very few people even talking about these kinds of things before. And if they tried, they'd be drummed out or even had pressure put on them. But now we're at least getting to the point where a large segment of the population is becoming concerned with the plight of immigrants and the treatment of certain ethnic groups. So the other side of this is that it's more or less contrasted by the efforts of the government to minimize the opportunities for minority groups and immigrants. And this is often motivated by xenophobia, which is an important term for us to know, which is the fear of outside culture. So the state seems to be more concerned at this time than the people or the nation at large as to the effects of allowing additional immigrants come into the country and the relaxing of sort of traditional controls on ethnic behavior inside the country. This could be evidenced of the Chinese Exclusion Act and alien land laws and things like that. Trying to hold on to that status quo seems to be a concern of the state. And don't get me wrong, by a large segment of the nativist population as well. But we do see, as evidenced through liberal Christians and through settlement houses and other aspects, that it is starting to be on the mind of at least some Americans. The other thing to note about this whole section, this Ellis Island middle period of mass immigration, is also the high water mark for the Americanization movement. So we're all pretty familiar with the idea of Americanization. You come to the United States as an immigrant, and you're expected to jump in, so to speak, to the so-called melting pot. And there's some, a lot of disagreement and misconception about exactly what the melting pot is. But if we think about it, the melting pot is not people have to ditch their former culture before they immigrated, or their ethnic traditions, or even racial traditions, or religions, or anything like that. But there is the expectation that when you come to the United States, you do adopt sort of these founding principles of the American tradition, and that would be democracy and republicanism, small government, not socialism, not a welfare state, small government, not dictatorships or authoritarian regimes, an economy that is a free capitalist economy that requires people to work hard and take risks. That's the old Protestant ethic. And to cherish the institutions that you're coming for. That's the melting pot. But not to ditch your traditions. That would be something that you take with you, you practice at home. We can imagine the sort of the Italian influence in New York City, where you've got the Italian restaurant and sort of that large family, hospitable vibe. But at the same time, it's an entrepreneurial enterprise where business is happening and you're working hard to make that dream come true. And that's the melting pot. And that's where, in this time period, is where we see it the most. And eventually that will fade away in favor of more modern impressions of how we should handle things, most notably the multicultural society.